A book under discussion today is Colossus, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire by Ferguson. He is a British historian who focuses on British and American imperialism. Ferguson's thesis throughout the introduction, the first chapter, is quite simple. The US is an empire. It always has been one, and it would be better for the rest of the world if the US presidents start behaving and understanding that they are one. And instead of having this long tradition of intervening into some regions and countries, could then quickly withdraw in forces, leaving all the mess, this chaos, instability behind them. They should actually stay long enough in those regions and countries and pay for their actions. And Ferguson puts it that America is an empire in denial, and I quote, and it's everything an empire but the name. The book is all about the fact that the US is an empire. And interestingly enough, there is a quote from Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president of the US, an anti-imperialist, who has said, "No empire, no way." But the US is an empire. But why? America was created by killing natives, then fighting neighboring countries and buying land wherever they could. After those boundaries were settled somehow, they've decided that they should get colonies in Pacific and Caribbean by any means at all costs. But this idea actually is not new. But to Ferguson's mind, he stands out of everyone who's spoken on this issue by the fact that he says that, well, it is true, but the Americans don't go far enough. And all the values that they are trying to implement, so democracy, liberty, capitalism, free trade, they are not doing it well, and they're harming themselves by not doing and providing them properly to the rest of the world. And well, now talking about a bit the successes and failures of the US, for example, success of the Hawaiian rulers, and what has happened, the US decided to overthrow the royal family and put some businessmen instead of them. Actually, the failures were the rest of the America and the Caribbean colonies. What was the most successful part? When they intervened directly, but they governed as well, and they did it repeatedly. And not only did they do that, but also they provided some money for the governors, not quickly withdrawing their forces, but actually staying there long enough. And as an example would be Panama, where they've just completely decided to go for the fact that the Panama had a chance to be taken over, and they decided that they should build a new country, build Panama Canal, and all the governmental problems did not change at all, because the US just did it for the resources and for the sake that they could benefit from it.
Demonstrating how 9/11 was the result of decades of Middle East mismanagement and rising Islamic terrorist groups that the United States did nothing to combat. How the defeat of the United Nations in the Yugoslav civil wars and the genocide of Rwanda showed the United States that it must and should go it alone, showing that a coalition of the willing is all decisive action in the post-Cold War world requires, and how the disasters of small-scale United States involvement in Somalia and Lebanon indicated that the United States could only participate in circumstances with a clear end goal, and then only with overwhelming force.
This is a definite article which could remain solitary, serving whether the US has the limits or backbone to stay in Iraq sufficiently long to fabricate a reasonable country-state, brazenly contrasting its solution approach with the historical backdrop of Britain's long reign in Egypt. The British expressed no less than multiple times that they would get out of Egypt, beginning inside long stretches of their informal triumph in 1882, while they wound up remaining for a long time. Ferguson contends a lot to Egypt's financial and lawful advantage. Another component in America's shortcoming is the hesitance of Americans to serve abroad. Most get postings to the Middle East for a year and they are before long back home among the, like how I would have said, burgers and soccer mothers. This causes knowledge, and there is essentially no comparable in American culture. This part likewise feels an independent article on the basic inquiry. Is the European Union a new realm fit for declaring Western qualities through bound together power in a manner which can challenge the United States? All things considered, no. Ferguson altogether destroys the thoughts and affirms one's feeling that the European Union is an organization committed to ensuring its representatives a remarkable way of life and securing French ranchers, totally neglecting to act definitely in any sort of crisis, from Yugoslav conflict to current refugees crisis. Basically, Ferguson claims that it is not true that decolonization has had negative effects for former imperial domains, and it is certainly very difficult and basically it's confusing that very few people in those countries are begging to enter to the empire again and to become a part of it. Also, he says that American empire is basically a unique empire, and America is alone. And however, it is capable to solve global problems. For example, Bosnia and Kosovo. He writes, "It has shown that American military leadership was the only effective solution to such challenges."
Thank you, Stepan, and I would argue that Ferguson is partially correct about that. The structure of international system has moved quickly from a managerial unipolarity to an aggressive unipolarity since the collapse of Soviet Union. No one in the world could rival the United States military power, and the eagerness of the United States government to intervene abroad has prevented other sources of regional stability from arising. After World War II, the US stepped in to fill the power vacuum left by the bankruptcy of British Empire, and the US intervened anywhere in the world to put those countries on the right path. Particularly that would be Korea, Iran, Iraq, Vietnam, etc. Moving on to chapter number 6. To point out a model of what a liberal empire could do, Ferguson talks about British colony in Egypt in chapter 6. Egyptian experience proves that, and I quote, "There is in fact a great deal to be said for promising to leave, provided you do not actually mean it or do it." British military presence in Egypt lasted 72 years and 66 promises to leave were made. However, I should say that Ferguson advocacy of a similar policy in Iraq is unlikely to sit right with the people of the United States. Moreover, the policy of deception is necessary because, as he states, as in Iraq today, there was at least some popular opposition to a foreign occupation. Egyptian resettlement never went away. Ferguson believes also that American manpower deficit can be solved if one adds together the illegal immigrants, the convicts, the unemployed. He says that there is surely ample raw material for a larger American army. With those groups in mind, Ferguson argues that drafting people can avoid being unpopular if targeted correctly, as it is stated in the conclusion. Ignoring the direct cost of empire, Ferguson identifies long-term structural imbalances in the U.S. economy, namely in the Medicare and Social Security programs, as a long-term threat to the imperial project. He points out the unsustainability in Americans' addiction to wasteful entitlements. He makes this claim relying heavily on one guy's research alone, and derived from Chapter 8, Ferguson fears, and I quote, the decline and fall of America's undeclared empire might not be due to the terrorists at the gates or the regimes that sponsor them, but to a fiscal crisis of the welfare state at home.
The most obvious criticism of this book, as of its predecessor, Empire, is that it gives little or no place for human experience, for the psychology of colonization and oppression. He doesn't take into account people's feelings or of the cultural impact of being ruled over. For this absence of feeling, Ferguson has been criticized, especially by writers who come from former colonies and who experienced the horrors of empire. Ferguson's favored theme is empire's economic success, and yet he ignores the enormous contribution made by plantation slavery to British economic growth in the 18th and early 19th centuries. This trade with the plantation zone furnished Britain with a large mass of profits, elements of a new world of exotic consumption such as sugar, tobacco, dyestuffs, etc., and the crucial raw materials for the Industrial Revolution, like cotton. As well as an important market for British manufacturing exports. So he admits that Britain's first empire was marred by pillage and rapine, with a swollen slave trade from Africa, looted cities and in the Americas, and horrendous famine in Bengal. The very term laissez-faire was coined by a colonial trader, but he overlooks these and instead execrates the role of the chartered companies.